Grab a warm drink and get comfortable. Today, we are going to travel north, far north. We are going to talk about a jagged piece of land that hangs from the top of the globe, like the claws of a predator, the Scandinavian Peninsula. Now, when we say Scandinavia, we often think of social welfare, minimalist furniture, and happy citizens. But the story of this land specifically, the rocky spine that makes up modern-day Norway and Sweden, is much wilder than that. It is a story carved by ice, defined by the sea, and forged in iron. Imagine this 12,000 years ago. There was no peninsula. There was only white. A massive ice sheet, kilometers thick, crushed the land. It was so heavy that it actually depressed the Earth's crust. When that ice finally melted, the land began to rise, a process called isostatic rebound that is actually still happening today. As the ice retreated, the first people arrived. They weren't Vikings. Not yet. They were hunters following the reindeer. Herds across land bridges from Denmark and moving in from the wild east of Finland. They settled on the coastlines because the interior was essentially a frozen hellscape. For thousands of years, these people lived in quiet isolation. They etched mysterious carvings into rock, ships, suns, and animals, messages to gods we no longer know. But the quiet wouldn't last. The population grew, the climate cooled, and the people of the north realized something crucial. The sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. Let's fast forward to the late 8th century, around 793 AD. This is usually where the movie starts. The people of the peninsula had mastered a piece of technology that would change the world, the longship. These weren't just boats, they were engineering marvels. They had shallow keels, meaning they could cross the open ocean and sail up. Shallow rivers to surprise sleeping villages. We call them Vikings, but Viking was actually a verb. To go a Viking meant to go on an expedition. Now history often paints them as mindless barbarians. But let me tell you, that is only half the story. Yes, the Norwegians sailed west to raid England, Scotland, and Ireland. They were terrifying. But look at the Swedes. The Swedes looked east. They sailed across the Baltic, down the rivers of Russia, all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. They were traders. They traded furs and amber for silver and silk. This was a time of immense energy. Imagine a young man from a small farm in a Norwegian fjord. He has no land because his older brother inherited the farm. So he hops on a boat, sees the pyramids of Egypt or the markets of Persia, and comes home with silver coins to buy a farm of his own. But this era ended. Why? Because the North changed from the inside. Christianity arrived. Around the year 1000, the old gods Odin, Thor, Freya began to fade. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason brought Christianity to the north, often at the tip of a sword. With the church came structure. We moved from chieftains to kings. We moved from oral laws to written laws. And eventually we moved toward union. Here is a name you should remember: Queen Margareta. In the late 1300s, this brilliant woman managed to unite Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into the Kalmar Union. Imagine that, one massive Nordic superstate. It was designed to block the power of the German Hanseatic League, who controlled all the trade. But like siblings sharing a room, the nations couldn't stop fighting. The Danes, who were centrally located, wanted to run the show. The Swedes, fierce and independent in their forests, hated taking orders from Copenhagen. This tension exploded in 1520 at the Stockholm bloodbath. The Danish king, Christian II, invaded Sweden and executed nearly 100 Swedish nobles in the main square of Stockholm. The streets literally ran red, but the king made a mistake. He missed one young nobleman, a man named Gustav Vasa. Gustav Vasa escaped, skied through the winter forests of Dalarna, a journey commemorated today by the famous Vasaloppet ski race, and rallied the farmers. He threw out the Danes and modern Sweden was born. The Union was dead. The peninsula was now divided. Norway stayed under Danish rule. While Sweden stood alone, now things get surprising. In the 1600s, Sweden, this cold, sparsely populated country suddenly became a global superpower. Under King Gustavus Adolphus, known as the Lion of the North, Sweden built a modern army. They stormed into Europe during the 30 Years' War. At one point, the Swedish Empire controlled Finland, the Baltic states, and parts of Germany and Poland. They even had a colony in America, New Sweden, in modern-day Delaware. Meanwhile, Norway was having a harder time. They were the junior partner to Denmark. They were heavily taxed, and their men were sent to fight in Denmark's wars. The 1700s saw the decline of the Swedish Empire. They fought a massive war against Russia, the Great Northern War. It was a disaster. The Swedish king, Charles the Fiend, tried to invade Russia, which, as Napoleon and Hitler would later learn, is usually a bad idea. He failed. Sweden lost its empire and turned inward. Let's step into the 1800s. The wars were mostly over, but a new enemy appeared: hunger. Both Norway and Sweden were incredibly poor. The population was exploding, but the rocky soil couldn't feed everyone. This led to a mass exodus. Between 1850 and 1930, nearly one-third of the population emigrated, mostly to the United States. If you go to Minnesota or North Dakota today, you see the result of this hunger. But those who stayed began to industrialize. They found wealth in their natural resources: timber, iron ore, and hydroelectric power from those thundering waterfalls. Then came the 20th century and the World Wars. Here the peninsula split in destiny again. Sweden declared neutrality. They walked a tightrope, trading iron ore to Germany, while secretly helping the Allies and taking in Jewish refugees. It's a controversial legacy, but it kept their cities from being bombed. Norway was not so lucky. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded. The Norwegians fought back heroically, sabotaging heavy water plants to stop the Nazis from getting an atomic bomb, but they suffered under a brutal occupation for 5 years. When the smoke cleared in 1945, the modern era began. So how did these poor frozen farmers become the wealthy, modern nations we know today? 2 different paths to the same destination. Sweden used its intact industry, since they weren't bombed, to become a manufacturing giant. Think Volvo, Ericsson, IKEA. They built the Folkhemmet, the people's home. It was a social contract. You pay high taxes, and the state looks after you from cradle to grave. Norway, on the other hand, hit the jackpot. On Christmas Eve 1969, they discovered oil in the North Sea. But here is the genius part. They didn't spend it all. They put the money into a massive sovereign wealth. Fund a savings account for the future generations. Today, Norway is one of the richest nations on Earth per capita. Both countries, along with their neighbors, developed the Nordic model. High trust, high taxes, strong unions, and a focus on equality. As we wrap up our hour together, look at the map of the Scandinavian peninsula one last time. It is a place of extremes. Darkness in winter, midnight sun in summer. It has gone from the violence of the Viking raids to being the home of the Nobel Peace Prize. It went from starving farmers to the most advanced digital societies on Earth. But underneath the Teslas and the modern architecture, the spirit of the landscape remains. The Norwegians have a word for it: friluftsliv, free air life. The belief that returning to nature is coming home. Despite all the history, all the wars, and all the politics, the soul of Scandinavia is still found in the quiet of the forest and the sound of the waves crashing against the granite coast. Thanks for listening to this story of the North.